If I think back to the time when I was working on these paintings, after many, many years, I finally finished the 7th book of Proust. And I think that there are ideas that really come to fruition in the final book that ended up, I hope, somewhat in these paintings. In that final stretch of the last book, he really talks about the idea of involuntary memory, and these tiny moments that exist completely outside of the narrative of one's life. Some of the examples are, of course, there's the Madeleine, but there's also like a moment when he steps backwards onto some uneven paving stones and is transported back to this church in Venice. Proust's mission was to kind of hang on to these crystalline moments as a way to somehow evade time completely. And, my paintings are much more mundane moments, much more banal moments in a way. But I think they too are these tiny little crystalline nuggets of memory that really sit outside of like the major narrative of my life. So whether it's walking across a lawn under the moonlight to throw away trash, or, hanging out in a parking lot outside the grocery store, these little kind of shimmering moments just linger in this kind of small way that has nothing to do with like the major narrative arcs of one's life. Like in general, this is borrowing a term from theology, but I've been really interested in the idea of the via negativa, which is a term, more in a religious context for turning away from like the height of God's creation and the most beautiful things in the world in terms of understanding, existence and the human experience and the meaning of life. Anyways, there's this great lecture about the via negativa and Samuel Beckett, who I've been completely obsessed with lately, and as well as, writers like Sylvia Plath, and I think you could throw into that, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, even Eliot, writers and artists who focused on the negative sides of experience and the lowly and the mundane. And I do think that these paintings, in a way, relate to that kind of via negativa in terms of like looking at the trash and looking at the lowly and looking at these things that we discard that don't seem like they should be the subject matter for, large history painting, scale paintings. It's taken me a very long time, but I feel like I've found kind of a philosophical home among writers like Beckett and Dostoevsky, who are they're dark to the point of being comic, and in that extreme dark comedy, I feel like there is some kind of, not salvation, but at least some kind of kernel of meaning. In a way, I think that my work in general can almost function as a kind of updated genre painting. Like think about like paintings of people harvesting wheat, or like Seurat's Le Grand Jatte, like these very, in different milieus, these very just normal activities. Trash bags, like trash bags and shopping bags, they all kind of reflect our bodies and our desires and our habits, whether we're proud of them or ashamed of them. So using these props was kind of a way for me to just have like an external emblem of what's going on internally with a figure, and just being aware of the kind of quantity of the cast-off of one's life it's an interesting way to reflect on how you exist in the world. The works I think that influence these paintings are works that are completely enmeshed in my life to the point of total familiarity. So like Basilitz's Heroes series has been really important to me for the last few years, and I love the one painting of the two figures called The Great Friends, and that painting I've looked at so many times that it's almost become like the emblem in my mind of a couple or a duality of two figures. So I think that if that painting has influenced the works. It's like very far in the background, but you know, a painting like The Expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden by Masaccio is just so kind of like culturally ever present that that's also kind of in my mind as a total archetype of what it is to be a couple in a kind of scenario of shame or discomfort. You know, I think there is kind of like a mannerist or a Baroque ethic of torsion and twisting the body to try to sort of record as many emotions over the span of just, you know, one figure in one static moment as possible. So you definitely see this in Bernini, for instance, where a body is kind of torqued around in a totally unrealistic and impossible fashion in order to create like a multiplicity of moments within really just one, you know, one pose. Obviously my figures are much flatter and cruder than Bernini, but in their own way, I think they're doing a similar thing. Actually, something that I think about all the time is the way that the cartoon character Daffy Duck moves. And I heard an interview a long time ago with Chuck Jones, and he talked about Daffy Duck as both rushing in and fearing to tread at the same time. And I always loved that cartoon logic where like a character's legs will be rushing in and kind of expressing confidence, whereas like their head and their mind has already decided that they're uncomfortable in the situation and is trying to get out of the room. So that's definitely something that I've been trying for in my work for a long time, is this kind of multiplicity of feelings across one figure in one single moment. To me, I feel like I only ever remember sort of a postcard size worth of a landscape. And so these landscape, you know, pseudo-landscape paintings are very simplified and in a way very small relative to the actual landscape. Whereas I do think that the people that we know, the people that we're close to, and our ideas of ourselves loom incredibly large in our minds. I think faces and facial expressions loom very large in our minds. And so with these portrait heads, I wanted to try to kind of approach that scale, the scale of the mental landscape rather than the real landscape. One thing that I only realized in retrospect was that these figures almost function sort of like narrators in a greater story. I think they feel much closer to kind of emotional self-portraits to me. These paintings are kind of, I think, intentionally a little bit more diffuse because I feel closer to them in a way. They're not exactly scenes, they're an interpersonal situation. I see it even clearer in literature than I do in painting, that one can take the most, you know, extreme parts of one's personality and the things that concern one the most and put them together into this kind of Frankenstein character who is really not at all a self-portrait, even if there might be these really obvious resemblances. I think that they're kind of like, I hope that they're sort of porous amalgams of many different faces and many different figures. Like, we walk around and see advertisements with faces and bodies in them all the time, and, you know, in a way that I guess relates to like Lacan, we attach ourselves to those figures and faces and kind of like compare ourselves but also integrate them into our own self-conceptions. And so I think that these paintings, these faces and figures, are general because they kind of contain our own misconception of what we look like, as well as our, you know, gathering of other images of how we feel and how we feel we look and all of that. So they're kind of general in that way. Working all in one session, wet into wet, in this very physical way with, you know, big brushes and not a lot of room for picky detail and not a lot of room for second guessing. It was kind of a way to trick myself into basically a more honest approach to painting, where, for better or worse, everything is left there in the surface, every mishap and every kind of awkward moment. And I guess in the end, that's the kind of painting that I've always loved, the painting that reveals both the bad decisions and the good decisions, and the moments of struggle and the moments of ease. I think related to the idea of honing in on these very mundane moments is something like, I think all the time of the Eliot line, I measured out my life in coffee spoons. And I do think that the accumulation of these very tiny moments, in a way, is kind of what we're left with after time has passed. So in my case, it's not coffee spoons, it's trash bags and, to-go cups. But I think these are the things that kind of measure out a life. It also relates, I think, to that Howard Nemerov poem, Life Cycle of a Common Man, in which, a life is measured in the number of coffees one has ordered and the number of times one has introduced oneself, and, the trash and the purchases and all these things. These are the things that kind of add up to something, for better or for worse. Maybe that sounds a little fatalistic, but I think we have to come to terms with them because they're such a huge part of their lives, and I don't think they should be ignored.